Hey, everyone. Tonight, let's drift back to a time when survival wasn't exactly something to celebrate. You survived the plague. Congratulations, supposedly. No parade was held in your honor. No bards wrote songs about your heroic resilience. Mostly because there's no one left to do any of that now. The only person who might have applauded you is your neighbor, but he's currently decomposing somewhere behind his chicken coop, and to be honest, you were never that close anyway. You didn't survive out of bravery or medical brilliance. You survived because you happened to be just inconveniently healthy enough not to die. While everyone else developed boils the size of goose eggs and began leaking ominous fluids, you coughed once, slept for 3 days, and woke up mildly inconvenienced but otherwise intact. And now, here you are, standing in the middle of a street that used to be loud, smelly, and inconveniently full of people, and finding, rather tragically, that you kind of miss all 3 of those qualities. Silence used to be a luxury. Now it's everywhere. You used to complain endlessly about the local baker shouting at his apprentices before sunrise. Now you haven't seen bread in 3 weeks. The miller, who routinely overcharged you for grain, is gone too, which would have been great news had he not taken all the stored flour with him when he keeled over into his own supply barrel. Your attempts at retrieval were unsuccessful. No amount of sifting could remove the essence of former Miller. You didn't like people, but solitude, it turns out, is even worse company. You start talking to walls, not intentionally. It begins with small things. Should probably sweep this. You mutter to no one while kicking aside a pile of dust that might be half chimney soot, half ex-villager. Then you begin assigning personalities to abandoned furniture. The table in your house is now Gregory. He judges you silently for eating cold turnips with your hands. The stool in the corner is Edith. She's supportive. She understands. You begin holding scheduled meetings with them after dinner. You present daily updates on your emotional state. Gregory is unimpressed. Edith applauds your efforts. This is fine. Completely reasonable behavior. You're thriving, actually. Probably. Occasionally, you spot another survivor in the distance. You consider waving, but there's a mutual understanding among plague survivors. Acknowledgement is a risky social investment. If you wave, they might wave back. Then what? Conversation? Polite small talk? Worse, a shared meal? What if they're clingy? What if they're cheerful? What if they try to move into your house? What if they ask to borrow Gregory? You once thought you disliked humanity for its flaws. Now you avoid it for its potential demands. Meals have become inventive. You used to gag at the thought of eating stale bread. Now you've developed a complex culinary system based on mold categorization. Blue mold? Acceptable. Green mold? Only if toasted. The gray variety? If you close your eyes. You've eaten things that would make your former self weep. You've become a master forager. Not in the elegant woodland herbalist sense, more like a determined raccoon with slightly better posture. At night, you lie awake, listening to the wind rattling through empty homes. The moonlight spills across rooftops that once sheltered gossip, arguments, and deeply regrettable musical attempts. Now they're just roofs. You thought you wanted peace. But peace without contrast is just emptiness. You whisper, quietly, "I miss being annoyed." Even Gregory agrees. But let's drift a bit further back. Before you were the sole survivor of mild resentment. Before your deepest friendship was with a wooden chair. Let's explore why everything went so spectacularly wrong in the first place. Because plague doesn't just happen. It's helped along, usually by humans making terrible choices. And medieval humans, well, they were extraordinarily gifted in that regard. Let's drift gently now from your lonely cottage of psychological unraveling into the mismanagement, denial, and slightly theatrical incompetence that allowed an entire continent to melt into chaos. Not that anyone meant harm. No. They were merely confident, loud, and profoundly wrong, which, historically, is the most dangerous combination. So lay back, breathe slowly, and let's remember together. So, there you are, alone, slightly feral, emotionally dependent on furniture. But before the silence, before the solitude, there was noise and panic. and medical advice so profoundly unhelpful that it would have been better classified as performance art. Because when the plague first arrived, nobody quite knew what to do with it. And naturally, rather than admitting confusion, people did what humans always do when confronted with overwhelming danger. They pretended to know what they were talking about. Medieval doctors, and I use the term doctors loosely, as most had medical training consisting of owned a book once, came up with every possible explanation for the plague except the correct one. Some blamed the stars. According to the Paris Medical Faculty of 1348, a highly respected group of scholars who had never washed their hands, the plague was caused by a harmful alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars. Which is fascinating, considering Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars had been minding their own business for billions of years, only to suddenly be indicted for mass murder. Other experts blamed weather, specifically too much warm, damp air, as if the atmosphere had simply gotten a bit stuffy and decided to exterminate humanity in response. Some blamed baths. Yes, cleanliness was considered suspicious. This remained a recurring theme in European history for several unfortunate centuries. The logic went, people who bathe seem to get sick. Therefore, bathing causes illness. Not, everyone is getting sick because everyone is covered in fleas. No, the fleas remained tragically unindicted. And then there were the treatments. You might think, in an era without microscopes or epidemiology, doctors might take a cautious, humble approach. Absolutely not. They burst into action like overly confident alchemists at a craft fair. Common plague remedies included applying dead pigeons to the armpits. Medicinally, this did nothing. Emotionally, it was devastating for both patient and pigeon. Drinking vinegar and crushed emeralds. Excellent for hydration. Fatal for emerald supply. Sitting between two roaring fires to drive out the cold humors. Many patients did, in fact, stop being cold, permanently. Bloodletting. Because if someone is dying, why not speed things along? If a doctor arrived at your house, you had precisely two options. Accept treatment and die dramatically. Pretend you weren't home and die naturally. Meanwhile, the clergy had their own theories. Some declared the plague a divine punishment. They held massive public prayer gatherings where thousands of people clustered together in tight proximity, coughing enthusiastically. This, as you might imagine, did not stop the plague. In fact, it transformed it into more of a group activity. But medieval enthusiasm for praying harder at danger remained unshaken. And then came the flagellants. If you've never seen a large group of shirtless men whipping themselves in the town square while chanting hymns about moral decay, congratulations. You've lived a deeply fortunate life. The flagellants believed that self-inflicted pain would convince God to cancel the plague like a misdelivered letter. They traveled town to town in dramatic parades, beating themselves rhythmically while shouting confessions like, "Forgive us for wearing brightly colored shoes. Forgive us for enjoying cheese immoderately. Forgive us for unspecified thoughts about our cousin's wife." They weren't helpful, but they were extremely memorable. Back in your village, before it became an exclusive retreat for one slightly confused survivor, you remember watching these bizarre procedures unfold. People burning herbs in the streets. People screaming at invisible demons. People wearing masks filled with flowers, as if lavender could stop a hemorrhagic fever. And the irony? The only people who consistently survived were the ones no one trusted. The hermits, who never left their huts. The poor shepherds, who lived outside town with only goats for company. The widowed grandmothers, who muttered to themselves and refused visitors. Society looked at them and said, strange, suspicious, probably cursed. But history now declares, correct, functional, exemplary social distancing. So now, as you sit at your mostly clean table, with Edith the encouraging stool and Gregory the judgmental chair, you realize you have become one of them, one of the eccentric survivors, a future legend in your village folklore, assuming anyone survives to tell it. Let's drift onward, quietly, because while you, a humble, non-plague-dying individual, handled things with reluctant dignity, the nobility behaved significantly worse. Kings fled their capitals. Queens hid in castles so drafty they may as well have camped outside. Nobles fired their servants, then panicked because they no longer knew how to pour water for themselves. Some monarchs even issued official statements explaining why the plague definitely wasn't their fault. It was, in short, a masterpiece of elite incompetence. And we will explore it together. You, a humble, formerly disgruntled villager, survived the plague by accident, stubbornness, and possibly out of spite. But how did the important people fare? The crowned, perfumed, excessively inbred elite? Not well. Because while the plague did not discriminate, kings very much believed it should. When rumors of pestilence first crept into royal courts, monarchs reacted with their usual grace and dignity. They fled, immediately, abandoning cities with such enthusiasm that if you had blinked, you'd have seen nothing but a swirling cape and a faint scent of rosewater. Royal proclamations went out declaring, "The king has temporarily relocated for the safety of the realm," which, translated, meant, "Good luck, peasants. The throne will be answering no further questions." King Philip VI of France, for example, issued an official medical decree. It recommended avoiding sad thoughts, listening to pleasant music, spending time in scented rooms. In his defense, this was excellent advice if one was attempting to recover from mild disappointment, less so when facing bubonic swelling the size of apricots. King Edward III of England, meanwhile, made a bold decision. He declared that all streets must be cleaned of animal carcasses, which was an excellent idea, except for the fact that his own war horses had been trampling garbage into the roads for decades. His solution? He fined the city. Not anyone specific, just the city. It was like finding the wind for being slightly chilly. Then there was King Alfonso XI of Castile, a man of great determination and average longevity. He decided that he simply would not catch the plague. An admirable mindset. Slightly delusional. He continued hosting feasts. He continued attending court. He continued acting as though sheer royal willpower could repel bacteria. It did not. He died. Expensively. The papal court, stationed in Avignon, attempted a more inventive approach. Pope Clement VI declared his entire residence a plague sanctuary, meaning anyone within its walls was automatically safe. It was a bold bureaucratic maneuver, attempting to negotiate with illness through ecclesiastical paperwork. To reinforce divine protection, he spent his days sitting between two enormous fires, believing the flames would purify the air. This technically worked. Unfortunately, he also nearly roasted himself alive. So, yes, he survived the plague. By slow basting. Royal physicians also had recommendations. They advised kings to avoid eating fruit, avoid sleeping during the day, avoid thinking too much. This last point was followed with great enthusiasm. And then there were the palace isolation strategies. Some kings sealed themselves inside castles so thoroughly that entire wings were bricked up. Food was passed through small openings. Letters were read with tongs. Servants were required to hold their breath when entering rooms. In one case, a paranoid duke reportedly communicated with his staff by shouting through a drainage pipe. This was considered responsible leadership. Of course, while the nobles fled, the peasants stayed behind. They buried the dead. They fed the remaining animals. They cleaned the streets that no one else would clean. And what thanks did they receive? Higher taxes, naturally, once the kings returned and realized someone still needed to pay for all that fleeing. So here you are, sitting in your quiet village-turned-personal kingdom, realizing you may, in fact, be more competent than half the monarchs of Europe. You performed pandemic response by accident, and still did a better job than several crowned heads of state who had access to entire treasuries. Truly inspiring. While commoners like you survived through grit, turnips, and emotional attachment to furniture, the noble classes survived, or attempted to, through boredom-induced chaos. Because nothing reveals the fragility of aristocratic dignity quite like being trapped in a castle with one's own family. In theory, castle quarantines sounded luxurious. Endless food, until the servants died. Fortified walls, against peasants, not pathogens. Private courtyards for serene reflection or dramatic fainting. In practice, it was like locking several dozen mildly inbred peacocks in a stone box and waiting to see who would snap first. Entertainment quickly became a problem. Feasts were no longer appropriate. Parties were risky. Falconry lacked excitement when the falcons refused to return. So nobles turned inward. Artistically, some took up poetry. This was unfortunate for everyone involved. Quarantine poetry ranged in tone from, "O death, thy shadow doth approach," to "I dream nightly of cheese, glorious cheese." The latter was arguably more sincere. Romantic affairs flourished, not because of passion but sheer lack of options. When one is trapped indoors with only distant cousins and emotionally constipated retainers, standards erode rapidly. Servants reported hearing exchanges like, "Cousin, I once found you deeply irritating, but now you are the least irritating object in this castle." Love, as always, found a way, usually through poor decision-making. Alcohol consumption soared. Wine cellars were ransacked with heroic determination. Some nobles rationed it carefully. Others said, "If the plague takes me, it shall find me pleasantly marinated." One German count reportedly drank so steadily that when the plague did arrive, it politely turned back, assuming he was already deceased. Fashion also evolved. Without formal court events to attend, nobles began experimenting with private attire. This often meant wearing full ceremonial robes with no trousers, hunting boots and nightshirts, crowns at breakfast. Royal etiquette manuals failed to clarify whether one should or should not wear jewels while eating porridge alone. Most chose yes. Family tensions escalated. Long-held resentments bubbled up during chess games. Entire feuds were reignited over seating arrangements. There were documented instances of noble siblings challenging one another to duels over blanket distribution. The duels were rarely lethal, mostly because no one remembered how to use a sword properly without a squire to assist. And then, of course, there were the musicians. Every castle had at least one relative who owned a lute and believed destiny was calling them. You know the type. Quarantine emboldened them. They composed moving ballads about isolation. Most contained only two themes. I am lonely, but noble about it. Please clap. Servants began hiding the instruments for the safety of all. Meanwhile, back in your quiet village, you feel almost serene by comparison. Your days are silent, rhythmic, predictable. You speak to chairs. You eat moss without complaint. You sleep without being serenaded by Cousin Peregrine's heartfelt piece titled, "Ode to My Reflection in the Wash Basin." Isolation may have frayed your sanity, but at least you were spared aristocratic whimsy. And so we drift forward, because now that you've seen how kings fled and nobles unraveled, it's time to explore one final question. Eventually, the dying stopped. Not all at once, not cleanly, but one day, you woke up and noticed something peculiar. The air smelled less like smoke and despair. The birds began singing again, cautiously, as if unsure whether it was socially appropriate. The wind, which had spent months howling through empty alleyways like a wandering spirit, now merely breezed. And it dawned on you, slowly, like an old dog remembering how to walk. The plague had passed. This was, in theory, cause for celebration. But there was a problem. No one remembered how to be alive. Before the plague, life was predictable. Not pleasant necessarily, but structured. You woke to church bells. You worked fields or shops or kitchens. You complained about neighbors. You fell asleep to the sound of livestock and gossip. Now you woke to silence, walked past empty houses, and genuinely missed the neighbor who always accused you of stealing their onions. You did steal their onions, but that isn't the point. Rebuilding society is not as dramatic as history likes to suggest. It was not a moment of triumphant music and flags. There were no glorious speeches. There was no king riding down the road shouting, "All clear, resume civilization." It was more like, "Well, I suppose someone should do something." Your first instinct was to clean. Not out of virtue, but because if you saw one more dust pile shaped vaguely like a deceased acquaintance, you were going to scream.
So you swept.
You organized. You spoke sternly to Gregory the table and informed him that he would now be hosting actual humans again, so he should prepare emotionally. And then came the others. Cautiously, like deer approaching a pond. One morning, you saw a figure in the distance. You froze. They froze. You both nodded in mutual acknowledgement of extreme social discomfort. Neither of you waved. That would have been too intimate. But you coexisted in the same radius. And that was progress. Slowly, painfully slowly, people began to return to old behaviors. Someone reopened the bakery. Their first batch of bread was terrible. The flour had gone stale. The yeast was depressed. But it smelled like something other than decay. You bought a loaf. You pretended it tasted wonderful. You cried privately because it tasted mediocre, which was glorious. Markets reappeared. Not bustling, shuffling. People sold things they had found in abandoned homes, insisting they were ethically acquired. They were absolutely not. But no one asked questions. There was an unspoken rule. If you didn't use it while you were alive, it now belongs to someone more determined. Children were the first to recover. They ran through the streets chasing chickens that did not belong to them. Their laughter sounded almost alien at first, too bright for the muted world. You resented it, briefly. Then you found yourself smiling. Against your will, the church bells rang again. Not to mourn, just to exist. You heard them and felt something unfamiliar.
Not joy.
Not sorrow. Direction. And so, life crept back. Not in grand declarations, but in small indignities. Someone complained that prices were too high. Someone's goat escaped and ate someone else's laundry. Someone tried to sell plague charms repurposed as romance amulets. You felt annoyance rise within you like a long-lost friend, and you whispered reverently, "Finally." Because survival is not defined by silence. It's defined by noise, by argument, by inconvenience, by petty frustrations. And as strange as it sounds, you were ready to be irritated again. Once the plague had finally loosened its grip, once the common folk had begun sweeping debris, rebaking bread, and cautiously rediscovering the joys of being mildly irritated, the nobility returned. They did not sneak back quietly. No, they arrived. In processions. With banners. With trumpets that no one asked for. You watched them descend the road like heavily perfumed pelicans, wearing velvet coats that had clearly been unworn for months, mostly because velvet is notoriously flammable near open hearths. Of course, they claimed they had never truly abandoned you. They had been coordinating relief efforts from afar. A statement which raised several questions, including, what efforts? Where were they coordinated? Was there relief? Royal decrees began pouring in. Grand declarations with phrases like, "The Crown hereby announces a restoration of normalcy." Pleasant words if anyone had remembered what normal meant. They announced new taxes to repair the kingdom, which was intriguing, considering the kingdom had repaired itself in their absence. It was a bit like someone disappearing during a house fire, then returning afterward and charging rent. The nobles also attempted to reassert social order. They insisted that everyone go back to knowing their place. But this was difficult because no one remembered their place. Quite a lot of places were now dead. Former servants had taken up new roles. Former laborers had become independent craftsmen. Widows had become landholders. Peasants had become merchants. Shepherds had become local legends. Telling them to return to subservience was like telling a cat not to judge you. They heard the words. They simply refused to comply. One particularly bold count announced, "It is time to restore the feudal system." His audience, who had spent the last year feeding themselves, replied by asking, "Is it?" It was the politest uprising in history, a solid no. Thank you. Many nobles were stunned to discover that the peasants had gotten ideas. Dangerous ideas. Ideas such as, why work for free if no one can make me? If I cultivated this field alone, perhaps I should keep it? Actually, your castle doesn't impress me anymore. To the aristocracy, this was chaos. To everyone else, it was mildly refreshing. Of course, some nobles tried bribery. They offered grand pardons, feasts, even titles. A few peasants accepted. Some became knights. This horrified the old guard, who hated the idea of knighthood being earned through competence rather than lineage and jousting at inappropriate times. The kings themselves did their best to appear heroic. They rode through villages wearing impressive cloaks, followed by retainers distributing bread that had clearly been baked by someone else. They claimed credit for the recovery of the realm. The realm politely pretended to believe them. It was easier than arguing. You, meanwhile, watched all of this unfold with the calm wisdom of someone who had once held lengthy conversations with a table named Gregory. You had seen death, silence, madness,
Mold.
King's posturing was quaint, almost nostalgic. They could posture all they liked, but something had shifted. The world would not go back to the way it was. Not fully. And so, as the trumpets blared and proclamations fluttered across the land, you leaned back, crossed your arms, and thought. You survived the silence. You survived the loneliness. You even survived the noble re-entry parade, which, emotionally speaking, was the most taxing of all. Now, people expect you to simply be normal again, to chat pleasantly at the market, to discuss weather patterns as if you hadn't once eaten a handful of unidentified moss because you liked the color. They expect you to smile more, to attend gatherings, to nod respectfully at local authorities who spent half the plague in a wine cellar praying aggressively. They expect you to trust, to plan for the future, to feel safe. But after living in a world where everything could end in a single cough, safety feels like a rumor. You stand at the edge of the village square, freshly broomed, bustling softly with commerce, and you feel both present and distant. A ghost haunting your own life.
People laugh again.
Not hysterically, not in denial, just normally. And instead of comfort, it makes you uneasy. Not because anything is wrong, but because everything is no longer threatening, and your brain, heroic in its persistence, hasn't gotten the memo. Even the inconveniences feel surreal. Someone complains loudly that eggs are more expensive now. You remember eating acorns for breakfast during month 5 of the Great Starvation and wonder whether it would be socially acceptable to throw an egg at them for dramatic effect. You decide against it. Growth. One day, someone invites you to a feast. A real one. Not a funeral by another name. Not a rationing circle. A celebration. There will be roasted fowl. Music.
Dancing.
You have not danced since before the plague. The last time you tried, you tripped over a turnip root and blamed it on the wind. But now someone is looking at you expectantly, holding out a cup of freshly brewed ale, asking, "Are you coming?" You hesitate. You think of Gregory the table, Edith the stool. You consider informing them you'll be away for the evening, out of politeness. Then you realize you are not just a survivor anymore. You are a participant again. So you go. You walk into the feast. It is noisy, crowded, utterly overwhelming. Someone bumps into you and apologizes. Someone offers you bread. Someone makes a joke about, remember when everything was terrible? You laugh. Not loudly, not theatrically, but genuinely. It feels strange, like using a muscle that forgot its purpose. But it holds. You eat. You talk. You endure a lute performance titled Song of the Joyful Reawakening of Humanity. It is terrible. Beautifully, comfortingly terrible. Later, as the fire crackles and conversations drift into sleepy murmurs, you look around. Children asleep on laps. Chickens wandering under tables. A nobleman attempting to dance, poorly. It is ridiculous. It is imperfect. It is alive. You close your eyes and inhale the scent of roasted meat, spilled ale, excessively perfumed nobility, and faintly smoldering garlands. And you whisper, not to Gregory, not to Edith, but to yourself, I am still here. Because hardship shapes you. Isolation cracks you. Survival hardens you. But living softens you again. Slowly. Quietly. Like dawn following a very long night. And so we drift to rest. History will remember empires and battles. But somewhere, beneath the noise of kings and chroniclers, it will also remember you, the one who survived, rebuilt, and learned to laugh again. Now that we've spent some time with our humble survivor, let's drift towards someone considerably less humble. You see, while ordinary citizens endured plague with dignity, desperation, and furniture companionship, some nobles got creative. And by creative, I mean spectacularly unhinged. Allow me to introduce Lord Percival of Westmarch, a middling aristocrat whose greatest talent, prior to the plague, was avoiding taxes with religious fervor. When the plague arrived, Lord Percival took one look at the growing chaos and made a bold decision. He would die, not biologically, not spiritually, but administratively, because to him, dying on paper was far preferable to facing civic responsibility. Conveniently, one of his household servants actually caught the plague. Less conveniently for the servant, Percival saw an opportunity. With the elegance of a particularly lazy fox, he declared,
"Ah, yes.
That is me. I am dead now. A tragedy. Please send all condolences in gold." He then swapped identities, forging a death certificate for himself, and rebranded as Brother Humphrey, a wandering monk with a suspiciously manicured beard. You might ask, why go through all this trouble? Simple. As Lord Percival, he owed debts, levies, and one rather furious neighbor who claimed Percival had borrowed 7 pigs and returned 0 pigs. But as Brother Humphrey, no obligations, just soft robes, free bread, and the ability to grunt noncommittally when asked theological questions. For months, he wandered from town to town, living his best fraudulent monastic life. He offered blessings. He quoted scripture very incorrectly. He healed ailments by placing a warm turnip on someone's forehead and whispering, "Be cleansed." Shockingly, people believed him. Not because he was convincing, but because everyone was tired, and no one had the energy to question a man holding a holy turnip. Unfortunately, 2 events brought his peaceful deception to an end. He accidentally performed a marriage ceremony incorrectly, saying, "You are now somewhat wed before God," which caused legal confusion for years. More critically, the plague ended. And suddenly, his former lands were restored, his name re-registered among the nobility, and officials began inquiring why his supposedly dead self had been recently seen sermonizing to goats in the next county. Thus, Lord Percival was dragged back to his estate, unmasked as a still-living, aggressively dishonest aristocrat, and placed before a tribunal of equally dishonest aristocrats. Their verdict? Faking your death is deeply unethical. Also very clever. Please teach us how. Rather than punishment, he received a consulting position in noble tax evasion tactics. Because of course he did. Percival, Brother Percival, auditor of saintly loopholes, lived comfortably for years, insisting that technically, he did spend time in holy service, even if half of it involved blessing vegetables. And so, dear listener, let us softly appreciate this. Some survived the plague through courage. Others survived through resilience. And a rare few survived through administrative fraud, vegetable therapy, and a good hooded cloak. Now, as we gently descend deeper into the featherbed of historical incompetence, let us turn our gaze toward one of the most confidently unqualified professions of the medieval world. The plague doctor. If you picture a wise, scholarly physician in noble garb, erase that. Replace it with a man wearing a bird mask, holding a stick, with medical credentials consisting of owning the bird mask and the stick. Congratulations! You've met the healthcare system of 1348. Enter our featured expert tonight, Master Theobald of Swinford, licensed physician, by divine insight and guesswork. Master Theobald had one important quality: unshakable confidence in knowledge he did not possess. His treatment philosophy was simple. If the patient lives, I am brilliant. If the patient dies, God's will. Not my fault. His most notable medical practices included bleeding absolutely everyone. Fever?
Bleed.
Headache?
Bleed.
Mild sadness? Triple bleed. One man came in for back pain, and left fully unconscious and 40% lighter. Prescribing gemstones. He once taped an emerald to someone's forehead to absorb pestilence vibrations. The patient died, but looked stunning. Diagnosing via smell. If a home smelled foul, it was plague. If it smelled pleasant, it was witchcraft. He had no protocols for neutral scents, so he usually set something on fire to decide. Despite this breathtaking inefficiency, Master Theobald made a fortune.
Why?
Because competence was optional, but confidence? Priceless. He arrived to every patient's house striding like a man who had once read half a medical pamphlet and considered it a divine calling. During one outbreak, he proudly announced a new miracle cure. Rub your armpits with onions while chanting Psalm 32. When asked why armpits, he replied confidently, because that is where demons hide. No one could prove otherwise, so the entire town began aggressively seasoning themselves. To this day, historians remain unsure whether this reduced plague transmission or simply reduced social interaction due to overwhelming odor. Eventually, Theobald was asked to train apprentices. This, naturally, was disastrous. His official lecture series included such bangers as surgery, just be quick and hope. Bones, they'll heal or they won't. Phlegm, a mystery for future scholars. He graduated 16 new plague doctors. May God forgive us all. Surprisingly, he survived every outbreak, not through cleverness or hygiene or herbal insight, but because he never touched anybody with his actual hands, preferring instead to poke patients from a distance using his official diagnostic stick. Truly, the first practitioner of social distancing. And so, dear listener, as we nestle into the pillow of reflection, let us appreciate history's greatest lesson. Medicine has come a long way. We now have antibiotics, vaccines, sanitization protocols, and yet still, somewhere, somehow, there is probably a modern Theobald prescribing onions and confidence. Sleep peacefully with that thought. Let us drift now into one of history's least dignified medical anomalies. Meet Prince Leopold of Altenburg, heir to a respectable but entirely forgettable little duchy whose primary exports were sheep and mild disappointment. Leopold was, by all accounts, a frail young man, not in a poetic, tragic way, more in a coughs when exposed to sunlight, onions, or assertive conversation way. But all of that was manageable until coronation season. Now, as tradition required, every future ruler of Altenburg had to wear the ancient crown of their forefathers, a majestic, intricately worked band of gold, silver, velvet lining, and, regrettably, unwashed wool padding from approximately 1263. The moment it touched Prince Leopold's fragile scalp, his entire head swelled like an offended pufferfish. Eyes gone, ears gone, hair gone, dignity long gone. The court physician declared, with grave solemnity, "Your Majesty, you are allergic to sovereignty." Naturally, chaos ensued. The royal council debated solutions. Option 1. Replace the crown with a new hypoallergenic model. Rejected. Tradition must not be compromised, even if the king suffocates. Option 2. Wrap his head in linen before applying crown.
Tried.
Resulted in crown sliding dramatically over his face mid-ceremony. Applause was confused. Option 3. Crown him from a respectful distance using a long pole. Attempted. Pole snapped. Crown hit him directly. More swelling. Eventually, an emergency compromise was reached. They would hold the crown near his head while declaring him king, without actually letting it touch him. Thus, Prince Leopold became the first monarch in history to be symbolically crowned adjacent to the throne. He was thereafter known by the affectionate title, Leopold the Almost Crowned. To maintain public illusion, painters were ordered to include the crown hovering mysteriously above his head, like an early saint icon or a confused flying saucer. Leopold ruled moderately well, mostly issuing decrees from beneath a soft linen hat, just in case the crown was hiding nearby. He lived to old age, respected, if slightly inflatable. And so, dear listener, as we drift steadily towards sleep, let us absorb this gentle lesson from history. Some rulers were brave, others were brilliant, but a rare few were simply allergic to leadership. Now, if you've been under the impression that humans held a firm grasp on legal sanity throughout history, allow me to gently correct that notion. Tonight, we enter the enchanting realm of medieval animal trials, a real and fully documented legal phenomenon in which courts of law earnestly prosecuted pigs for murder, termites for property damage, and one particularly suspicious dolphin for improper advances.
Yes, truly.
Let us begin with the case of the disorderly rooster. In 1474, a rooster in Switzerland committed the unforgivable sin of laying an egg. The townspeople were horrified.
Why?
Because folklore claimed that a rooster's egg could hatch a basilisk, an apocalyptic lizard capable of killing with its gaze and generally ruining everyone's morning. Naturally, the rooster was arrested. Not metaphorically, physically, placed in chains, given a lawyer, and tried in a court of law for witchcraft. The prosecutor delivered a rousing speech about satanic poultry. The defense attorney reportedly said, "My client deeply regrets the egg." Verdict: guilty. Sentence: execution by fire. History does not record whether the egg was also charged. Next, we glide gracefully to France, 1522, where a group of rats was summoned to court for eating a barley harvest. They failed to appear for trial. The judge issued a second summons. Still no rats. The court eventually ruled that perhaps cats were preventing the rats from attending, so the trial was postponed to allow safer travel arrangements. Yes, lawyers genuinely debated rodent transportation logistics. But perhaps the most iconic case was that of the pig of Falaise, 1386. A pig allegedly bit a man, who later died. Authorities arrested the pig, dressed it in human clothing, and executed it in the town square, while the townsfolk watched solemnly, because justice, apparently, demanded a well-attired spectacle. Some animals even filed lawsuits against humans. In one case, weevils were sued by angry vineyard owners for destroying grapevines. The court asked the weevils for a defense. A monk, speaking on their behalf, argued, "They, too, are God's creatures. Perhaps we should plant them their own vineyard instead." Shockingly, the court agreed and allocated a designated insect vineyard. Whether the weevils complied remains unconfirmed. Likely not. And so, as we lie here in the soft glow of absurdity, let us reflect. Medieval law was not always wise, but it was never boring. Sleep softly, knowing that if reincarnation is real, you could one day return as a beetle with legal representation. Our next subject is Sir Geoffrey of Montfort, a minor nobleman with major self-confidence issues, primarily because he possessed both too much confidence and absolutely no reason for it. Sir Geoffrey was infamous for challenging people to duels over the slightest inconvenience. Someone sneezed too loudly in church?
Duel.
Someone disagreed about the weather?
Duel.
Someone dared to suggest that geese were just birds and not sky knights. Immediate duel. But one day, no one would duel him. His reputation had grown so exhausting that the entire region began collectively refusing to acknowledge his challenges. So, naturally, Geoffrey reached the only logical conclusion. If no one else is worthy, I shall duel myself. The rules were set. The challenger, Sir Geoffrey. The defender, also Sir Geoffrey. Witnesses were invited. Most declined for reasons of sanity, but a few attended out of morbid curiosity and complete spiritual fatigue. He declared the match official. He stood on one end of the courtyard as Geoffrey, the offended party, then walked to the other side, turned around, and became Geoffrey, the accused coward. He bowed politely to himself. He insulted himself loudly. He vowed to show no mercy, especially to myself. The duel commenced. He swung his sword with theatrical flair and immediately tripped over his own scabbard. Fell flat on his back. Concussion. Unconscious. Match concluded. The crowd stood silently. Then, unsure of protocol, someone asked, "So, did he win or lose?" Another replied, "Both." Thus, the records officially state, Sir Geoffrey of Montfort, defeated in honorable combat by Sir Geoffrey of Montfort. After his recovery, Geoffrey declared it a humbling and necessary victory. He never dueled again, possibly because he had proven to be his most difficult opponent to date. Sleep peacefully, dear listener. If ever you feel embarrassed about past mistakes, just remember, you have likely not been bested in armed combat by your cell. Tonight's fragrant subject is King Wenceslas III of Bohemia, not to be confused with the other Wenceslas, who was famously good. This one was noticeably less cleansing. Wenceslas developed a firm philosophical stance early in life. Bathing is unnatural. Water is treacherous. Soap is foreign espionage. Which, admittedly, is a bold theory, especially for a man constantly standing downwind of himself. His official hygiene doctrine included no bathing,
Ever.
not even partial rinsing, minimal changing of clothes. His garments were so stiff with accumulated residue that they could allegedly stand upright on their own. Sleeping in hay instead of linens, because hay absorbs scent like a loyal subject. Spoiler, it did not. Court records claim that his stench could be detected rooms before his physical arrival, giving courtiers valuable time to pretend to be asleep or dead. Foreign ambassadors routinely held meetings wearing scented cloths over their faces. One Venetian diplomat wrote, "Negotiations went well. However, I fear I must burn my nose." Eventually, the church attempted intervention. A bishop gently suggested a ceremonial washing in holy water. Wenceslas reportedly recoiled like a vampire facing sunlight and shouted, "You will not drown me in papal broth." Negotiations ended. His wife, bless her resilient soul, moved into a separate wing of the palace, citing irreconcilable humidity. Royal scribes began writing edicts from further and further away, eventually shouting legislation from a hallway. And yet, shockingly, he lived to a decent age.
Why?
Several historians, with completely serious faces, suggest that fleas, lice, and parasites simply refused to live on him. His sheer aura of biological hostility may have formed a protective barrier. In essence, he may have become the world's first scent-based immune system. So, as you drift into sleep tonight, take comfort. Whatever state your hygiene is currently in, you are not King Wenceslas. And if you are, please reconsider your legacy. Weddings, in theory, are celebrations of love, unity, and mutual joy. Royal weddings, however, have historically been celebrations of political panic, international side-eye, and catastrophic social improvisation. Tonight, we wander through a few such matrimonial disasters, ceremonies so uncomfortable that nearby nations considered launching military intervention just to make it stop. The bride who refused to look at the groom for the entire ceremony. Our first tragedy unfolds in 1518, France. Princess Claude of France was arranged to marry Francis, Duke of Brittany, a charming, athletic, golden-haired specimen of Renaissance vigor. Unfortunately, Claude was firmly against the marriage. Not for political reasons, not due to scandal, simply because, as she allegedly said, "His eyebrows frighten me." On the wedding day, she refused to look at him. Not once. Not even for the ceremonial. You may now gaze lovingly at your spouse. She stared directly ahead like a prisoner awaiting sentencing while he beamed proudly at her like a man unaware of danger. Diplomats whispered nervously. Priests stalled. A lute player fainted from tension. The marriage proceeded. They eventually had 7 children, presumably conceived via sideways eye contact avoidance. The groom who arrived so drunk he married the wrong person briefly. In 18th century Bavaria, a minor prince, unnamed in records, perhaps mercifully, arrived to his wedding already celebratory. So celebratory that he mistook one of the bridesmaids for the bride. He vowed eternal devotion to the wrong woman with confidence, kissed her enthusiastically, and only realized his mistake when the actual bride slapped him with a ceremonial glove so hard the choir stopped singing. Emergency correction followed. 2 ceremonies were performed that day. The accidental wedding. The official one. Technically, some argued he was now bigamously married. which led to 3 months of legal proceedings to determine which woman he was more married to. The marriage that caused a border crisis over who walked through the door first. In 1630, Spain and Portugal attempted to unite two noble houses through marriage. Except disaster. Both families insisted their bride should enter the church last, because in court etiquette, the last to enter is the most important. Thus, the Spanish bride refused to move. The Portuguese bride refused to move. Guests stood frozen like mannequins. Standoff. 2 hours. Eventually, one father-in-law suggested they enter simultaneously from 2 different doors. Perfect solution. Except the church only had 1 door. They began arguing about who would build the second door. Negotiations nearly escalated into military mobilization. The wedding was postponed for 6 months until someone quietly led both brides in through a side entrance while distracting the fathers with complimentary sherry. So, dear listener, as you lie serenely in your bed, let this soothe you. No matter how awkward your family gatherings may be, at least no one has threatened to invade a neighboring country over door priority. Tonight's reluctant bride is Princess Charlotte of Savoy, a noblewoman born into privilege, prestige, and, unfortunately for her, aggressively marriage-minded relatives. Charlotte had one dream: to live peacefully in a quiet convent, reading scripture, tending gardens, and never speaking to men with political intentions. Her family had a different dream: to marry her off to whichever prince had the largest army and or the least alarming facial wart. Thus began Charlotte's Great Escape trilogy. Attempt number 1. The Silent Disappearance. At age 14, when her mother began casually hinting about a marriage to the Prince of Milan, Charlotte responded with dignity and grace by jumping out of a pantry window and running to the nearest convent. The nuns, bless their pure souls, welcomed her immediately. The royal guards arrived 3 days later and dragged her back home like a misdelivered loaf of bread. Attempt number 2. None but faster. 2 years later, new marriage proposal. New panic. This time, she snuck out disguised as a monk, allegedly shouting Latin phrases like, "Behold, I am very masculine," to avoid suspicion. She made it all the way to another convent before being recaptured. Her father, exasperated, said, "If you wish to be religious, you should have consulted me first about the correct faith-approved timing of your piety." Charlotte did not respond. She was too busy glaring. Attempt number 3. Holy Siege. At last, faced with a marriage contract to a 57-year-old duke with 3 surviving teeth, Charlotte enacted her final gambit. She sprinted into the convent chapel, threw herself across the altar, and declared, "I am now the bride of Christ. Touch me and you provoke eternal litigation." Her family, in awe of this power move, hesitated. Unfortunately, the Duke was wealthy and persistent, so she was gently, but firmly, peeled off the altar and escorted to the wedding. In the end, she married, but she did so scowling so intensely that the priest reportedly stammered through the vows. Records say she never fully adjusted to noble life. She donated heavily to convents, built a private chapel, and, according to rumors, demanded her husband knock before entering any room in case she was mid-devotion, which she often was. So tonight, dear listener, if ever you feel trapped by obligation, remember Princess Charlotte, who failed in her mission, but failed gloriously. Our subject tonight is Princess Matilda of Saxony, a woman whose greatest passion in life was not being married. Unfortunately for Matilda, she lived in the 12th century, an era when royal daughters were essentially walking treaties with dowries attached. Her father had grand ambitions. He wanted Matilda to marry into influence, wealth, and stability. She wanted silence, a book, and possibly cheese. Thus began her legendary series of escape attempts. Attempt 1. The classic disappearance. On the morning of her engagement announcement, Matilda simply vanished. Search parties scoured the castle, only to find her hours later, sitting calmly in a convent 2 miles away. She had politely asked the abbess for asylum. The abbess, thrilled to possibly gain a royal recruit, welcomed her warmly. Unfortunately, Matilda's father stormed in, declared the entire abbey unreasonably accommodating, and dragged his daughter home by wagon. She did not speak to him for 3 months. Attempt 2. The strategic illness. The next time marriage was arranged, Matilda fainted dramatically in the hall. When revived, she announced she had a wasting sickness and could not possibly marry. Doctors examined her. They declared her pulse suspiciously strong for someone wasting away. She was diagnosed instead with stubbornness of the female spirit, not yet a recognized medical condition, though heavily documented. The wedding plans resumed. Attempt 3. Full nun cosplay. On the actual day of her betrothal, Matilda arrived at the chapel already wearing a nun's habit. She declared before the entire assembly, "I am already a bride to Christ." This was awkward because her fiancé was standing right there, holding a ceremonial sword, looking profoundly betrayed. Her father canceled the feast, citing logistical embarrassment. Matilda was locked in her chambers for 2 weeks. Attempt 4. Almost successful. Years later, after exhausting everyone's patience, she fled again, this time to a distant convent in Bavaria. She shaved her head, adopted a new name, and lived peacefully as Sister Agnes for nearly 9 months. 9 months of pure joy. Prayers, bread, goats, freedom. Until one day, her brother visited the convent, recognized her instantly, told everyone, and once again, Matilda was escorted back to her princely cage, muttering psalms of pure rage. In the end, she did marry, a dull but harmless count. She bore 3 children and, according to chroniclers, spent most of her free time writing letters to nuns. Some called her rebellious, some called her foolish, but perhaps she was simply a woman born a few centuries too early, desperate to live a life that was hers. So, as you drift into slumber, take comfort. Whatever frustrations you carry, they likely do not involve being forcibly dragged from convents multiple times by armed relatives. And if they do, you have my deepest admiration. If you're still awake at this point, I admire your endurance. Tonight, we gently drift toward one of history's more overlooked chapters, the time a ruler allegedly became so annoyed at the moon that he declared war on it. Because of course he did. Now, emperors throughout history have declared war on many unreasonable things. Neighboring kingdoms, salad forks, rival cousins named also Henry, but very few escalated their grievances to such astronomical proportions. Our featured sovereign tonight is Nabonidus, the last king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire in the 6th century BC, a man who, according to several suspiciously amused chroniclers, developed a deep personal grudge against the moon, which was ironic because he was technically supposed to worship it. A king with one personality trait, moon obsession. Nabonidus was supposed to rule Babylon like his predecessors, meaning build temples, collect taxes, oppress mildly, and throw festivals in honor of Marduk, the chief god of Babylon. Instead, Nabonidus said, "Actually, I prefer Sin, the moon god. The rest of you can cope." And with that, he abandoned the capital, moved himself to an ancient Arabian outpost called Tama, and spent a decade living in spiritual isolation, like a divine influencer on a silent retreat. The Babylonian priests were not amused. They were expecting a king. Instead, they got a man sending letters like, "Dear clergy, I cannot attend today's rituals. I am busy gazing at the moon. Sincerely, His Luminous Majesty." When worship turns to warfare. Now, depending on which ancient historian you trust, which is like asking which pigeon tells more reliable gossip, things escalated from devotion to hostility. Some later accounts claim that during an especially inconvenient lunar eclipse, Nabonidus took it personally. As in, "Oh, so that's how it is?" And so, perhaps in a dramatic ritual or perhaps in a private meltdown, he is said to have declared war upon the moon, which raises many logistical questions. What was his battle plan? Siege ladders? Catapults? A strongly worded tablet inscription? Did he appoint the Minister of Celestial Combat? Did his generals nod respectfully, pretending this was perfectly normal? Meanwhile, back in Babylon, While the king was busy waging symbolic warfare against the night sky, his empire began doing something highly inconsiderate. It collapsed. The priests in Babylon, fed up with lunar favoritism, quietly opened the gates to Cyrus the Great of Persia, who strolled in and said, "So, is anybody in charge here?" The response was probably something like, "Technically yes, but he's busy yelling at the moon." A war he definitely lost. And just like that, Babylonia was conquered, not by siege or famine, but by administrative neglect and excessive astronomy. Nabonidus was captured, politely retired, and the moon, I must stress, remained completely unaffected. One can only imagine his final sigh. "I lost everything and the moon didn't even notice." Emperor Caligula versus the ocean. Ah yes, Caligula, Rome's answer to the question. What if you gave unlimited power to a man who should not be left unsupervised with scissors? Among his many achievements, appointing his horse as a priest, casually executing relatives for blinking too confidently, he also reportedly declared war on the sea. The story goes that he marched his army to the shores of Gaul, dramatically lined them up before the waves, and shouted some form of imperial challenge at Neptune, god of the sea. Then, in what might be history's pettiest military order, he commanded his soldiers to attack the ocean. The soldiers, who by this point had emotionally checked out long ago, dutifully stabbed the water. Some even filled their helmets with seashells, which Caligula triumphantly declared to be spoils of war. Somewhere in the distance, a crowd probably watched and thought, "Ah yes, Rome." Peter the Great versus Beards. Fast forward to Russia, 1698. Tsar Peter the Great, who was very determined to make Russia look more European, discovered that many of his nobles had beards, long, glorious, wizardly beards, and he simply could not stand it. And so, he declared war on facial hair. Not metaphorically. He literally issued a beard tax and would personally slice off beards with scissors if he spotted one in public. Imagine being a duke, walking proudly through Moscow, only to be ambushed by your monarch shouting, "Unacceptable," before aggressively barbering your chin. It was less a policy, more an unprovoked grooming assault. Britain versus itself, the war on cats, coffee, and umbrellas. If history teaches us anything, it's that Britain has occasionally gone to war with concepts. King Charles II briefly tried to ban coffee houses, believing they stirred dangerous levels of thinking. 19th century towns once attempted to outlaw umbrellas, calling them witchcraft and an insult to coach drivers. And at least one medieval monastery declared cats to be agents of the devil, which was followed shortly by an explosion in the rat population. A victory for cats everywhere. And finally, the Austrian army versus itself. Perhaps the most peaceful and tragic war of all was fought in 1809, when the Austrian army reportedly managed to attack itself by accident in a nighttime panic. In what became known as the Battle of Karansebes, two regiments, mistaking each other for the enemy, began fighting each other. By morning, there were 0 enemies defeated, only wounded pride and deep confusion, which makes it perhaps the only war in history where both sides lost simultaneously. Now, Charles had a complicated relationship with sanity. On calm days, he ruled France. On less calm days, he believed he was made of glass and forbade people from touching him for fear he'd shatter. During one especially intense episode, he reportedly became convinced that the wind was plotting against him. Not a storm, not a hurricane, just wind. And so, naturally, he issued an order forbidding strong breezes from entering his chambers, which is a difficult law to enforce unless one is willing to arrest the air. Servants were instructed to hang heavy curtains, stack shields against drafts, and in one recorded incident, a guard attempted to stab a gust of wind with a spear. The wind, showing remarkable restraint, did not retaliate. The Sultan who declared war on the color blue. In the 17th century, Ottoman Sultan Murad IV had a firm approach to law and order. He banned alcohol, coffee, tobacco, and walking suspiciously after dark. He was, in summary, a one-man HOA regulation. But perhaps his most baffling decree was his rumored hatred for the color blue. According to some chroniclers, Murad believed blue was an unlucky color and ordered it banned from clothing in his presence. This, of course, led to the world's first instance of, "I'm not wearing blue, Your Majesty. This is just emotionally cold green." Punishments for disobedience were severe. One poor official, allegedly wearing a sapphire ring, was demoted for chromatic insolence. To this day, historians are unsure whether Murad disliked blue for political, religious, or personal reasons, or whether he simply looked terrible in it. The Pope who declared beavers to be fish. Not quite a war, more of a categorical surrender to hunger. During the Middle Ages, Catholics were forbidden to eat meat on Fridays and during Lent. Fish, however, was allowed. This created a minor problem in parts of France and Canada, where people really wanted to eat beaver. Rather than following the rules like normal humans, they wrote to the Vatican and asked, "Technically speaking, if a beaver lives in water, swims like a fish, could we, count it as seafood?" And the Pope, perhaps exhausted, perhaps amused, approved. Thus, beavers officially became fish, but only when cooked during Lent. This may be the only time in history when a rodent was reclassified by decree in order to facilitate religious snacking. In 1814, after Napoleon Bonaparte abdicated for the first time, he was exiled to the tiny Mediterranean island of Elba. Most places would have sighed in relief. But Britain's neighboring island of Guernsey took no chances. They issued a decree that war would continue specifically between Guernsey and Napoleon, even though the rest of Europe had signed peace. Meaning one small island officially remained at war with one man who was stuck on another island and unable to reach them. Napoleon, for the record, never acknowledged this, which makes it possibly the only war in history where one side didn't know it was happening. Guernsey never surrendered. Technically, depending on how strict you are about paperwork, they remained at war with Napoleon until his death. A perfectly undefeated campaign. The city that declared war on soccer balls. Jump ahead to 1939, in the Irish town of Tralee. For reasons historians still find difficult to explain without sighing, the town council decided that football, soccer, was becoming too rowdy. One official suggested that the real threat to the peace was not the players, but the ball. And so Tralee banned footballs from public streets, declaring them a source of public disorder and noise. Offenders were fined for unlawful ball possession. To clarify, kicking the air was legal. Striking the concept of fun was not. Children, being natural rebels, immediately began smuggling footballs under coats and playing illegally behind churches like contraband dealers in a sports drama written by Tolkien. The president who declared war on skeletons. Finally, we arrive at Andrew Jackson, 7th President of the United States, a man who treated life like it was a tavern brawl he was determined to win. One day, Jackson reportedly walked into his estate and discovered that someone had placed a human skeleton in his house as a prank. Most people would scream. Jackson grabbed his gun. He fired at it.
Twice.
Only after it continued not moving, being, importantly, a skeleton, did Jackson calm down. He later referred to it as an intruder of the most silent kind. Some historians suggest he believed it was a spectral assassin. Others think he may simply have sincerely declared war on bones. Either way, the skeleton suffered no reported casualties. Enter Sweden's King Gustav III, 18th century monarch, opera enthusiast, and part-time fashion dictator. Gustav did not merely dislike certain styles, he legislated against them. In 1778, he declared war on extravagant clothing, accusing ruffled sleeves and fancy hats of destroying national discipline. He banned bright colors, silk stockings, gold embroidery, and, most tragically, excessively decorative buttons. Citizens were forced to wear uniform gray, brown, or black, turning Stockholm briefly into a highly disciplined funeral procession. Anyone caught wearing unauthorized flair faced fines. Historians have yet to confirm whether someone was imprisoned for having too enthusiastic a hat, but spiritually, yes, it happened. The emperor, who declared war on time zones. Not a king, but close enough. Joseph Stalin, having temporarily grown bored of purges and parades, decided to abolish time. Well, standard time specifically. In 1930, He ordered the entire Soviet Union to skip 1 hour forward permanently. Clocks were moved ahead and never moved back. For 61 years, the USSR was stuck in perpetual daylight savings because Stalin had declared war on the concept of morning. Millions of citizens simply woke up one day and discovered they had lost an hour of sleep forever. A uniquely Soviet form of suffering. The pharaoh who declared war on all other gods. Finally, we float back 3,300 years to Akhenaten, the Egyptian pharaoh who woke up one morning and decided that he didn't like polytheism anymore. His solution? Close all temples, ban all gods, replace entire religion with one sun disk. He declared monotheistic war on centuries of tradition, removing statues, erasing names, and rebranding Egypt as a one-deity state. Unfortunately, when he died, Egypt immediately said, well, that was a phase, and restored every god overnight, even the crocodile-headed one, just to make a point. Akhenaten's entire religious revolution lasted as long as an unpopular hairstyle, which, to be fair, he also had. We are still gloriously mid-ridiculousness. Would you like? Welcome to La Tomatina, Spain, a peaceful town that, in 1945, held a local parade in which a minor scuffle broke out. Someone grabbed a tomato cart. Someone threw one. Someone threw 5. Someone retaliated with the watermelon. Soon, the town was engaged in full agricultural warfare. In response, the city council outlawed tomatoes.
Yes.
Tomatoes. The fruit. Possession? Illegal. Use in sauce? Suspicious. Throwing one? An act of rebellion. Naturally, and in accordance with all human history, the citizens responded by organizing bigger tomato fights. The ban lasted only a few years before the government surrendered, re-legalized tomato combat, and officially declared it a festival of national importance, which means Spain is perhaps the only nation to lose a war to salad ingredients. The monk who excommunicated insects. In medieval France, a monastery suffering a plague of weevils did the logical thing. They took the insects to court. A formal legal trial was held. A lawyer was appointed to defend the weevils. Witnesses were called. Testimonies were heard. The monks argued, "These creatures are destroying our crops. They must be banished." The insect lawyer responded, "Surely, as God's creatures, they have as much right to eat as you." The court, showing remarkable patience, ruled that a designated field should be set aside for weevil consumption, while they were forbidden from entering monastic property. No records suggest the weevils obeyed, which means this remains one of history's few documented cases of insects winning a lawsuit. The Air Force versus clouds. In 1952, the U.S. military decided that clouds were not producing enough rain and therefore needed encouragement. Their solution? Operation Cumulus. They dropped 200 pounds of dry ice and silver iodide into the sky, hoping to force rain. What they received instead was a freak flood that destroyed an entire English village. The military quietly concluded that perhaps clouds should not be antagonized and abandoned the operation. Which leaves us with the question. Our story takes place in the Polish, Lithuanian Commonwealth, a political entity so complex that historians often describe it as a constitutional monarchy run by 600 nobles for committees and one extremely tired king. Now, normally in a monarchy, you have a king. You know who he is.
People bow.
Coins are stamped. Laws are grudgingly ignored. But in 1696, King John III Sobieski died, beloved for his military victories, but slightly less beloved for leaving behind no clear successor. So the Polish nobles, being very democratic in the least practical way possible, decided to elect a new king. Which sounds simple. It was not. The election that never ended. Candidates included a French prince supported by Louis XIV, who mostly wanted Poland as a decorative accessory, a German duke who promised stability, tax reform, and possibly free sausages, a Polish noble who wanted to be king because why not? Each faction declared their chosen candidate the true king, formed little camps, and began celebrating before confirming whether they had actually won. So, for a time, Poland technically had 3 different kings, all unofficial, none crowned, and none entirely sure if they had the job. But wait, it gets better. The discovery. Deep in the bureaucracy, dusty archives, unexamined for years, officials realized something shocking. There was already a king. Specifically, Prince James Sobieski, son of the previous king, had never officially been dethroned. Nobody had declared him not king, which means that while nobles were enthusiastically electing various dukes and princes, the throne was technically still occupied by a man they had forgotten existed. The royal reaction. When informed, Prince James reportedly said something along the lines of,
"Oh,
I'm still king? That's good to know." He had not been ruling. He had not been invited to meetings. No one had sent him tax revenue, royal correspondence, or even a politely worded fruit basket. He had been king in title, peasant in experience. And so, nobody won. To resolve the embarrassment, the nobles decided on the most Polish solution possible. They ignored the problem. Instead of choosing one king, they carried on with parallel monarchies, foreign claimants, and ongoing confusion, until eventually, foreign powers solved the issue by invading and partitioning Poland altogether. Which, frankly, is what tends to happen when your national leadership structure resembles an accidentally abandoned group chat. Our next moment of dynastic confusion takes us to England, 1066, a year so chaotic that history teachers usually just wave their hands and say, many people were king. Here's the situation. King Edward the Confessor died, without children. Harold Godwin's son said, "He promised me the throne." William of Normandy said, "He promised me the throne." Harald Hardrada of Norway said, "I don't know what he promised, but I'm taking it." And so all 3 declared themselves king simultaneously. Harold was crowned in London. William was crowned in Normandy. Harold crowned himself in Scandinavia, probably on a boat while yelling. England thus became the only kingdom in medieval Europe to be ruled by a committee of 3 kings who did not acknowledge each other. This dispute was resolved, as most medieval disagreements were, by everyone invading everyone, and concluding with William the Conqueror winning by killing King Harold at Hastings, failing to kill Harold Hardrada because someone else already had. Thus, England finally remembered who the king was. It took 3 coronations and 2 battles, but success was achieved. Portugal, the country that crowned a corpse. Our next monarchical oversight was less confusing and more extremely awkward. In Portugal, 1580, King Sebastian I rode into battle in Morocco and, well, vanished. No one found his body. No corpse. No crown. No forwarding address. This created a problem. If he was dead, they needed a new king. If he was alive, they already had one. So, what did Portugal do? They refused to decide. For years, they left the throne, technically, awaiting King Sebastian's return. He became a sort of Schrodinger's monarch, both ruling and missing. Poets claimed he would return on a foggy morning, like some royal weather-based prophecy. People whispered sightings. At least 3 men showed up saying, "I am Sebastian," and were politely imprisoned. Eventually, Portugal gave up and crowned a new king, only for Spain to promptly invade and claim the throne instead. Thus, Portugal remained briefly a kingdom ruled by an absentee king, an imposter king, and finally, someone else's king. 10 out of 10 chaos. Would not recommend. Our next royal oversight comes from medieval Spain, where succession could best be described as improvisational. Meet Berengaria of Castile, a quiet, competent noblewoman who technically became Queen of Castile in 1217 after her father died and her brother abdicated. She began ruling immediately. The catch? Most of the nobility didn't realize she was queen. They assumed she was just acting as temporary regent, like a royal babysitter holding the crown until a proper king arrived. So Berengaria spent months issuing decrees that people followed politely, assuming they were provisional suggestions. Eventually, someone asked, "Wait, is she ruling as queen, or just filling in?" This sparked a brief diplomatic pause, followed by,
Oh,
"She is the queen. Has been for a while." Huh. at which point she calmly handed the throne to her son Ferdinand III, as if to say, "Yes, I already did the job. You may proceed formally now." She is perhaps the only monarch who successfully ruled a nation without most people realizing it was happening. The king who lost his crown in a river and declared it legally irretrievable. Now let's gently splash into England, 1216, during the reign, or rather unraveling, of King John. While fleeing rebels, again, he attempted to cross the Wash, a marshy estuary known for swallowing the belongings of hasty idiots. Among the royal baggage carts were
Gold.
royal documents, the English crown jewels, all of which sank into the mud and vanished. John reportedly stared into the river like a man watching his dignity float away, then declared that the jewels were lost by act of God, meaning the church could not demand compensation. He then simply gave up ruling. Days later, he died, possibly from dysentery mixed with overwhelming embarrassment. Somewhere in the marshes of eastern England, a full medieval crown still lies buried. So if you ever go mud-walking and feel something metal under your boot, congratulations, you're king now. The monarch who abdicated by accident while asking for lunch. Finally, let's float over to Japan, 12th century, during the rule of Emperor Rokujo, who, like many emperors of the era, was mostly a ceremonial toddler controlled by retired uncles. One day, during a court ceremony, he reportedly said something along the lines of, "I'm tired. Can someone else sit there while I eat?" This was interpreted not as "I'm hungry," but as a formal abdication decree. Before he finished chewing rice, the throne had been officially transferred. He stopped being emperor in the time it took to request a snack. Possibly the fastest regime change in history.